My name is Kim Rubenstein, and as the Director of the Centre for International and Public Law, and also as convener of the ANU Gender Institute, I have great pleasure in welcoming you here this morning, together with the US Embassy, for this 150th anniversary of the US Emancipation Proclamation event. I think it is particularly appropriate for the Centre for International and Public Law and the ANU Gender Institute to be joining with the US Embassy for this historic occasion. And I'll say a little bit more at the end of the proceedings to clarify why I think that is in fact the case. But this morning I wanted to begin by thanking the US Embassy for giving us the opportunity to host this event here at the Australian National University, and to also thank the various individuals who put so much effort into organising it. Those from the US Embassy and those from the ANU, including Lucy Guest and Roxanne Lissingen, who have put a lot of time and effort into ensuring that this would be able to be held at this important time. But I would first like to introduce one of our honoured guests, the US Ambassador Jeff Bleich. Jeff Bleich probably needs very little introduction for many of you here because he has been such an active ambassador since he arrived in Australia in November 2009. He is in fact the 24th ambassador from the US to Australia and has really set out a very high standard in terms of his engagement with the Australian public and with issues such as this today, which include human rights. And perhaps that is as a result of his wonderful achievements already to date. And as an academic, I want to of course acknowledge his graduate of Harvard, a graduate of Berkeley. He's received a certificate in public international law from The Hague. He has an honorary doctorate from the law school from San Francisco State University. And all of this is a reflection of how he's built his commitment to human rights. He also stands with me as a former teacher of constitutional law, and as the head of the Centre for International and Public Law, he also taught international law. So we couldn't have anyone better, in my view, to be involved with the proceedings today. So please welcome Ambassador Jeff Bleich.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to the ANU for hosting this terrific event. This is a historic day, a day when we celebrate one of the crowning achievements in American history, and also a day when we acknowledge another historic moment, the first recognition of an Australian as a trafficking in persons hero by the United States State Department, the great Dr. Anne Gallagher. So, we do come together to remember a pivotal day, and as I said, a pivotal day in the United States history, but also a pivotal day for civilization. A day when millions of people, human beings, were delivered from slavery. A day when a good nation became a great one by denouncing once and for all the evil institution of slavery. Slavery was the unresolved contradiction of the United States. At the time of its founding, the United States was blessed with some of the finest and most forward-thinking minds and most courageous individuals of their generation. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. They imagined a new nation, one in which leaders didn't derive power simply by the accident of their birth or by grabbing it through force, but they imagined a society in which the people chose their leaders and their leaders served the people. It was an audacious idea at the time, based on, as Thomas Jefferson wrote, the belief that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And that among those rights is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words seem familiar today, but in 1776, this was a revolutionary concept. Nowhere else on earth at that time was there a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In fact, this idea was so radical at the time that no one, including the individuals who conceived it, knew whether it would work. And indeed, there's a story of Ben Franklin as he was walking out of Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, just after a constitution had been ratified, a woman crowd said, "Well, what is it, Dr. Franklin? Is it a republic or a monarchy?" And he looked at her and he said, "A republic now, if you can keep it. If you can keep it." The question was, could Americans keep this marvelous new type of nation together? And the founders were determined to preserve the unity of the states and their independence from England at all costs. Now, the founders were visionaries to their time, for their time, but they were also people of their time, with the blind spots and the prejudices that afflict all of us. Some were simply pragmatists. They weren't prepared to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and they knew that certain states would never join the Union if they banned slavery. Other founders, though heroic in some other ways, were flawed in this way, and they accepted slavery as a time-honored tradition dating back to the Code of Hammurabi. And so, for varying reasons, they subordinated the controversial issue of slavery to the larger goal of preserving unity and the independence of the United States. This was the contradiction of our Constitution. A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal did not in fact extend equality to all men. It did not extend equality to black men and women. Now, some of the founders, like Thomas Jefferson, understood this terrible contradiction. The idea of challenging slavery then, even for Jefferson, was simply more than the fragile republic could bear. But Jefferson, slave owner himself, also recognized that one day there would be a great reckoning. And he said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." Jefferson was right, that God's justice could not sleep forever, and the institution of slavery ultimately divided the United States to the point where slaveholding and non-slaveholding states went to war with one another, turning neighbors against neighbors and brothers against brothers. It remains today the bloodiest and costliest war in U.S. history, taking more American lives than all other wars combined. President Abraham Lincoln, at first he thought his sole goal was to hold the Union together. But as the war raged on, he recognized that the inhumanity of slavery had been a cancer that had produced the capacity for untold cruelty and inhumanity and slaughter. And the true peace could not be achieved as long as slavery existed. Ultimately, injustice to any man was injustice to every man, and it had to end. In the weeks leading up to his proclamation, Lincoln recognized that the United States could not continue as a nation built on freedom in which certain men and women lived with no freedom. That a house divided between free people and slaves could not stand. And so 150 years ago, he issued a proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22nd, 1962, Lincoln ordered that the 3.1 million slaves in the rebel states be freed. In doing so, he made clear that the war's mission was no longer merely to reunite the states, but to unite them as a truly free nation. It was a new birth of freedom. The abolition of slavery transformed the United States from a house divided by internal moral contradictions to a nation that could at last live up to the promise of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women were created equal. Reflecting on the many lives that were lost, the great human suffering that slavery had created, Lincoln stood at Gettysburg and he expressed a new hope for all mankind. From this tragedy, he called upon us, one and all, to dedicate ourselves to this great pursuit, that we renew our faith in the proposition that all men are created equal, and that we work to ensure that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall never perish from this earth. In the years that followed, the nations of the world individually and then together, collectively, came together to outlaw slavery anywhere and in all of its forms. In 1926, the first convention to abolish slavery was signed, and today, slavery is outlawed in every nation on earth. And yet, the work is not done. We know that some forms of enslavement continue to exist. People may be enslaved by trickery. Traffickers make false promises of a job, or migration, or marriage. They prey on people's hopes and their sincere aspirations. Or they simply abduct people. They frighten people. They use physical force. They drug people. They use dead bodies, take them to distant places, and abuse them for sex, for labor. Today, as many as 1 million people are trafficked across borders each year. And that, too, is part of the reason why we gather here today. We come to fulfill the promise that began with the Emancipation Proclamation of freedom for all humankind. And we come to honor the courage and commitment of heroes, people who devote their lives to stopping human trafficking. It's fitting that we acknowledge our past at the same time that we commit ourselves to the cause of combating all human trafficking. We do this work not because we believe we're better than anyone else. It's because we know that at times we have in fact been worse than that. It's born of an acknowledgement of our past mistakes and the dark parts of our history. We don't hide them, and we don't hide from them. We remember them, and we work hard to rectify them. And we honor the efforts and the sacrifices made to bring justice and freedom by people like Dr. Anne Gallagher. And so today, before I recognize our 2012 hero, we remember Lincoln's words. And we're blessed today to have Kamahl, one of the greatest voices and greatest hearts in all of Australia. The recipient of the Order of Australia, the Centenary Medal, the Australian Father of the Year, and just an all-around magnificent bloke. Thank you, Kamahl, for joining us today to deliver the Gettysburg Address in honor of this occasion.
Good morning. It's somewhat overwhelming for me to be here. Thank you for the privilege. Thank you for the honor. There is a small irony, really, because I attended the Adelaide University for a number of years. There are one or two people who might be here. And after some 4 years, I did not pass any of the exams. Largely because I didn't sit for them. And in 1958, the Immigration Department in Canberra saw fit to follow their rules under which I came, and they sent instructions, firm orders to the Immigration Department in Adelaide that one Kandaya Kamahl should be sent back to where he came from. And for some inane reason, an immigration official, one Bill Schneider, decided to conveniently lose that file. And another conspirator was one Harry Wesley Smith, registrar of the university, a very kind man. And one other gentleman I met that December in '58 at a nightclub called the Lido, where I was entertaining. I only knew 3 songs, and I would sing them every 20 minutes. And at the end of the evening, just after midnight, he and his party were going somewhere and asked me if I'd like to join them. And I thought he was a glutton for punishment to hear it again. And I was taken to this party somewhere in the Adelaide Hills, and I sang the same songs again. But this time, this man who paid scant attention while I was doing my best at the other place called the Lido seemed somewhat excited, and I think mainly because of the reaction from his friends, but not his taste in music, rushed over to me and gave me a 10-pound note when in those days I would have paid anybody to listen to me. And that was the beginning of an association. I found out some 6 months later his name was Rupert Murdoch, who's here at the moment. And anyway, I'm thankful for his friendship. As far as why I'm here today, looking around, I feel like there's so many chiefs, me the only Indian, but anyway. But the occasion of the Gettysburg, the reason that I made a commitment to try and remember it was because in this very city, on the 16th of November, I felt I met one of the greatest persons I've ever met in my life. I've had the privilege of enjoying the friendship of Sir Donald Bradman and doing a few Royal Command performances. But for whatever reason that I can't begin to explain, I will never forget those some less than 120 seconds when I shook the hands of the President. Somebody making a comment about it. When I shook the hands of President Barack Obama. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's it.
I would now like to call upon the Ambassador to present the Hero Report.
How do you follow that? I used to say you don't want to follow children, cute animal acts, the President of the United States, and now I can add Kamahl to that list. Now we know that despite the great progress in the global effort towards freedom, this work, the work that Lincoln described as the unfinished business, is not done. And we celebrate a landmark event in the struggle for human freedom, we also dedicate ourselves to that unfinished work. Abraham Lincoln's legacy lives on in those who today continue to fight to ensure that no person's body is ever owned or exploited. And we celebrate one of those people today who carries on that legacy. It is a distinct honor to introduce a genuine, living hero in the great quest to eradicate slavery in all of its forms. Dr. Anne Gallagher. I've got a few more things to say about you, Anne. I could go on for a long time, but I won't because you want to hear from Anne. She's a lawyer, a practitioner, a teacher, a scholar, an activist, a global expert on international human trafficking, and a leader in the modern fight to end human slavery and trafficking in persons. Those who traffic in human beings are, by definition, brutal and dangerous people. And it requires courage and commitment to challenge them. And each year, the United States Department of State recognizes only a few select heroes who've put their energy, their life, their heart, their passion, and sometimes their own safety ahead of, before the cause to stop human traffickers. And for the first time ever this year, one of the awardees is an Australian. Now, as Secretary Clinton noted in recognizing Anne's achievements, her commitment to ending human slavery extends over 20 years. While she was at the UN, she played an important role in developing the very protocols that we use to stop human trafficking and migrant smuggling. She served as the founding chair of the UN Interagency on those issues. She led the development of the UN principles and guidelines on the subject. Here in Australia, for nearly a decade, she's led AusAID, Asia Regional Trafficking in Persons project. And that project is the world's largest and most ambitious criminal justice project against trafficking. And its impact has been felt both inside and outside of the ASEAN region. Her influential publications, in addition to having titles too long to recite, are also too numerous to recite. But you can sum it up by saying she literally wrote the book. She wrote the sole legal reference on the law of international human trafficking, as well as several articles, countless textbooks and handbooks, reports, training materials, you name it. If people want to know how to stop this, they turn to Anne. And in November 2011, she was awarded the inaugural Australian Freedom Award for her international work against contemporary forms of slavery. In June 2012, she was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia, and the appointment was made for her, quote, distinguished service to the law of human rights as a practitioner, teacher, and scholar, particularly in the areas of human trafficking, responses, and criminal justice. I could continue to share these accolades, but I think there's one that may be the greatest surprise for Anne, so I saved it for now. I was flying back with Secretary Clinton recently, and I mentioned that we were going to be having this event, and Secretary had the privilege of meeting Anne back in D.C. when she awarded her the 2012 Tip Hero Award, and she said 3 words. She said, "I love Anne." So we love Anne. Because of Anne, the promise of freedom is more than just words on a piece of paper. It is a living, breathing reality. And so today, as we prepare to recall the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, thank Anne for giving renewed life and hope to the noblest of all human enterprises, to liberate all mankind. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Anne Gallagher.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for that warm and generous introduction. I appreciate it greatly. And also your presentation, where you showed us so clearly how we can learn from the worst parts of our history as well as from the best. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, I begin by thanking Kamahl as well for his stirring and uplifting performance. That basso profundo voice was a familiar sound in my childhood home, and it's wonderful to hear it so many years later used to such powerful effect. Thank you. I also thank the Ambassador again, who's honoured me through the US government with the Tip Hero Award. The United States has displayed great leadership on this issue, and while we're not all comfortable with having the US shine its spotlight on us once every year, there can be no denying that this bright light has uncovered many dark corners of the world that have remained hidden for far too long. Brave leadership is required by all countries, including Australia. We can and should be doing as much as possible to influence the global movement to eradicate exploitation of human beings for profit. One of the great benefits of the award that I received from the US government was the chance to travel to Washington and to meet other heroes, individuals whose lives have been lived on the front line of the battle for human rights and human freedoms. People like Vanak, a shy Cambodian fisherman who spent 4 years trapped on a boat before he could escape, and now uses his talents as an artist to raise awareness about exploitation in his community. People like Sister Aziza, an Eritrean nun who spent the past few years documenting horrific abuses against migrants coming to Europe through the Sinai Desert. And Dr. Raimi, a GP, an ordinary GP, not really ordinary, from the Republic of Congo, who every day risks his life exposing forced labour and sexual exploitation of children, as well as treating victims of those crimes. It was a great honour to be recognised in such brave and distinguished company. At the ceremony to present the 2012 Tip Hero Awards and to launch the 2012 Tip Report, your inspiring, Secretary of State affirmed that these victims of modern slavery are women and men, girls and boys, and their stories remind us of what kind of inhumane treatment we are capable of as human beings, whatever their background. They are the living, breathing reminders that the work to eradicate slavery remains unfinished. As an international lawyer, I'm always cautious about making a blanket equation between slavery and trafficking. These practices have important distinctions that are recognised in law and that should be maintained. However, it would be foolish of us to deny the strong similarities between the evils that the Americans have for so long fought so bravely to eradicate and the kind of exploitation that is facing us today. The link is, of course, the denial of freedom. Both trafficking and slavery involve taking the freedom away from one person in order to serve the interests of another. Slavery might now be outlawed in every country on earth, but we've come to understand that making slavery illegal is just not sufficient. Freedom can be tricked out of someone. It can also, as the ambassador said, be forced or coerced. Sometimes the capacity to play on the vulnerability of an individual, vulnerability caused by violence or poverty or abuse of human rights, is sufficient to be able to take away a person's freedom. The scale of this trade in human misery is difficult to calculate. Latest estimates from the UN put the figure at 21 million, the number of individuals who are caught in situations of severe exploitation from which they can't escape. This shadow economy is accruing profits, estimated conservatively to be around $30 billion a year, and at least half of that is generated in wealthy, industrialised countries like Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, In order to understand exploitation properly, it's not enough for us to be outraged. We need to consider carefully how it happens, why, and who benefits. Some of those benefits are uncomfortably close to home. It's easy for us to be horrified about slavery while absolving ourselves from direct responsibility. But that's wrong and it's dangerous. Human exploitation has built our world and continues to fuel global economic growth. Cheap labour, cheap sex and cheap goods are woven into the fabric of our national economies, our communities and our individual lives. It's sobering to wonder, to imagine just how big our individual slavery footprint might be. We also have to face up to the fact that exploitation serves specific national interests. It's a sad reality that some countries derive great benefit from low-cost foreign labour, foreign workers who, deliberately unprotected by law, can be criminalised or shoved aside when circumstances permit. Some countries that maintain strong policy positions against prostitution are nevertheless comfortable with a marginalised and closeted industry comprised principally of exploited foreigners. Countries that rely heavily on remittances of their overseas workers may be reluctant to interfere with a system that brings economic benefits, even if it's clear that some of their citizens are being harmed. The battle against slavery, therefore, must be fought on many fronts. Individuals, corporations, civil society, governments, and the international community all have a role to play. Laws, political pressure, public exposure, and community actions are all equally powerful weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, Frederick Douglass, American statesman and former slave, used his gifts as an orator and writer to win the minds and hearts of many over to the cause of equality and of freedom. While Lincoln may have brought us all here together today, it's fitting that I give the last word to this man, another great American. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning for this really historic event. I alluded at the beginning that I would come back to the two institutions here at ANU that I'm very proud to be associated with. The Centre for International and Public Law as part of the ANU College of Law and the ANU Gender Institute. The Centre for International and Public Law's banner is not here because it is sitting on the other side of Fellows Road in the Law Lecture Theatre awaiting the beginning of our annual Public Law Weekend. The theme of the conference this year, some of you here are about to walk across the road with me, it begins very shortly, is Law's Challenge to Democracy, Democracy's Challenge to Law. And I think the themes that have run through this morning resonate with that very topic of our discussions over the next few days. The challenges we have in democratic nations in dealing with the issues that reflect inherent tensions in human society and human existence. And so the messages from this morning, I'm sure, will resonate with Anne's very compelling words, reminding us that law is not the only institutional framework to assist democratic nations, but it is so important when we use law to use it in the most powerful and effective way to achieve our democratic objectives. It's also appropriate that the ANU Gender Institute is involved with this morning's event because, of course, even though trafficking occurs to all human beings, the disproportionate number of women who we are concerned about in terms of trafficking is something that all societies need to pay particular attention to. Indeed, in all issues in society, it is so fundamental that we look at the gendered nature in which different policies and practices play out. And so the ANU is very proud to be reminding people and to be drawing upon the rich academic resources we have here to promote the research that does indeed look at the gendered nature of issues in society. And finally, as I said, I wanted to end in the ways that I would normally begin a presentation. And I think it is fitting to finish off today recognising and acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this morning, and for all of us to pay our respects to their elders past and future in the spirit of paying respect as we do this morning to those in the past who set the foundations for the democratic societies to which we aspire. Thank you, everybody.